Hey guys, what's going on? One of my previous videos, the top 35 chess principles, was my most popular video. So I'm very excited to bring you part 2, which is the top 25 endgame principles. So we're specifically going to be looking at principles that have to deal with the end of the game. So we've got a lot to cover. Let's get started. All right, principle number 1 is if you are ahead by a lot of material, don't get a stalemate. In this position, if white plays queen here, black's king now has nowhere to move because white is controlling all of these squares, but his king is not in check, so this is a stalemate, and instead of white getting the win, he would only get a draw. So if you're ahead a lot of pieces, watch out for stalemate. Principle number 2 is activate your king. Your king is a very valuable piece at the end of the game. The chances that you're going to get checkmated are very low because there's not very many pieces left, and your king is actually really good at capturing pawns, preventing pieces from moving to certain places, and so you need to activate your king at the end of the game. Principle number 3 is very similar to principle number 2, but you should try to centralize your king. By moving your king towards the center of the board, your king has the option to go to either side of the board, either corner of the board, anywhere that it needs to go depending on what your opponent is going to do. So centralizing your king is a very smart thing to do at the end of the game. Principle number 4 is that passed pawns should be pushed. In this position, white has a passed pawn on a2. That simply means that there are no pawns that can capture it on the way to becoming a queen. All the other pawns can be stopped by black's pawns, but this one cannot, so it's a passed pawn, and as the principle says, you should be pushing it forward. In this example, white can very easily win the game by going and getting a queen because black is too far away to stop the pawn. Principle number 5 is that if you don't have any passed pawns, you should try to create some. In this position, white can play a4, which is not currently a passed pawn, but by playing a4, he's threatening to go a5 next move, which would then become a passed pawn. So black could try to capture it, but after white recaptures, he has successfully created a passed pawn. Principle number 6 is that passed pawns should be supported by your pieces. In this position, if white just decided to blindly push this pawn forward, black would simply move his king, attack the pawn, and after white tried to defend, black could bring his rook up, and black has too many pieces attacking the pawn, white's going to lose his only passed pawn. So going back to the original position, before white pushes the pawn forward, a better plan would be to put the rook behind it, bring the king over to support it, and then he can push it forward without risk of losing it because he has pieces backing it up. So remember to support your passed pawns before you just blindly push them forward if your opponent has pieces that are going to be able to capture the pawn. Principle number 7 is that in a king and queen against a king endgame, the player with the queen should make a box, continually make the box smaller and smaller until eventually the opponent's king is forced to the edge of the board. Then you would bring your king up and over and achieve checkmate. If you want a detailed step-by-step example of how to do this, I'll post a link in the description below to another video on my channel. Principle number 8 is that in a king and rook against a king endgame, the player with the rook should again make a box, continue to force the king to the edge of the board, and bring the king up and over to get checkmate. Very similar to the queen. There are a few little extra tricks, but this process is roughly the same. Again, if you'd like to see a step-by-step detailed example, I'll put a link in the description below as well. Principle number 9 is that in a king and two bishops against a king ending, the player with the bishop should first form a V, like this, continue to make the V smaller and smaller until you reach this position, where black only has 2 places to go to, back and forth, and then you can force black to either one of the corners and achieve checkmate. Again, if you want to see a detailed step-by-step example, check the description below. Principle number 10 is that in a king and knight and bishop against a king endgame, you have to force the king into the corner that matches the color of your bishop. In this case, since our white bishop is on a white square, we have to force the king into one of the white colored corners. Because black knows that, he's probably going to go to the other corner, so you have to achieve this position right here where the knight controls the corner, supported by the king with the bishop behind, and then there's a particular maneuver that you do with your knight and a couple of steps that you have to follow to eventually force his king back to the correct corner where you can achieve checkmate. If that sounded too complicated, don't worry about it. I'll post a link as well for a detailed step-by-step guide you can follow to learn how to do the knight and bishop checkmate. As a side note, if you're a beginner watching this video, I wouldn't worry about the knight and bishop checkmate right now. It is very rare, it does not come up very often, but you should definitely focus on learning the king and queen checkmate, as well as the king and rook checkmate. Those are much more common and very good to learn for beginners. Principle number 11 is that in the king and two knights against a king endgame, the player with the two knights cannot force checkmate unless black voluntarily runs to the corner on his own. So if black decides to just head for a corner, then you can get checkmate. Otherwise, you will never be able to force it with just two knights against a good player. So with correct play, the outcome of this endgame should be a draw. Principle number 12 is that pawns on the edge of the board can be very difficult to stop, and this is especially true for knights. You can see in this position that white moves this pawn forward, and even though black has an extra knight, he's unable to prevent the pawn from becoming a queen. You can see if the knight tries to get closer, white's king is simply going to capture it. If the knight goes over here, the pawn's going to move forward. Again, the knight can't move here, it'd have to go here, and white just simply gets a queen, and the knight had no chance to catch the pawn. Principle number 13 is that two connected passed pawns on the 6th rank will always beat a rook. So if white plays this pawn forward, he now has two connected passed pawns on the 6th rank. And anything that this rook does to try to stop the pawns is not going to be enough. They are going to be able to, for at least one of the pawns to become a queen. As an example, if black plays here trying to attack this pawn, white can simply move this one forward. And if black captures it, this one becomes a queen. As another example, if black tried to move his rook here, white could do the same thing, and again we get the same result. White gets a queen. There's no way for the rook to stop the two pawns. Principle number 14 is that further advanced pawns tend to be more valuable than pawns that are not advanced as far. This is somewhat of a famous position where both players have 3 pawns, but it looks like black is going to win because he can simply bring his king over and capture the pawns, and white's king is going to be cut out of the action. However, white actually has a little trick to win the game, and it has to do with the fact that his pawns are further advanced than black's pawns. By playing the move b6, white is threatening to capture one of these 2 pawns, so black has to capture it. And it doesn't matter which way black captures, white can then sacrifice another pawn, threatening to capture here. Black has to recapture, and then white can sneak by, and this guy becomes a queen before these guys can, and white wins the game. So remember that farther advanced pawns tend to be more valuable than pawns that are sitting where they started and haven't moved forward. Principle number 15 is that opposition is important in king and pawn endings. If you've never heard the term opposition, it just means when 2 kings directly oppose each other. In this position, if white plays here, he is gaining opposition on black's king because he is directly opposing black's king. What this does is forces black's king to move to the side. And by doing that, white can then take advantage of that, controlling all of these squares. Now black cannot move there, and white can simply move his pawn forward and get a queen. If we back up in the same position and white did not play that move to gain opposition on black's king and simply moved his pawn forward, then black could gain opposition because he made the last move, and in this case it's actually a draw. You see what happens if white pushes the pawn forward, black simply moves over, and now white ends up with a stalemate and does not win the game. So remember that opposition is very important in king and pawn endings. And if you're still not clear on what exactly opposition is and you want a more detailed explanation, I'll put another link in the description below. Principle number 16 is that rooks should go behind passed pawns. In this position, you can see white has a passed pawn that he would like to become a queen. So if it's white's turn, he should move his rook behind the passed pawn because now the rook can support the pawn as it moves forward to become a queen. If we go back and it was black's turn in this position, he should also move his rook behind the pawn because now the rook is going to attack the pawn the whole way as the pawn tries to move forward, and it's going to be hard for the pawn to move forward. So rooks should go behind passed pawns. Principle number 17 is that the best type of passed pawns are connected passed pawns. The next best type are protected passed pawns, and the next best would be flank passed pawns. So in this position, these are connected because there's 2 right next to each other, so they can support each other as they move up the board and try to become a queen. A protected passed pawn is the next best because it already has something supporting it, so you can just leave it sit there and it's a constant threat to your opponent. And the flank passed pawn is the next best because, as we talked about earlier, it can be difficult to stop flank pawns, especially with knights. Principle number 18 is that opposite colored bishop endings are very drawish. Opposite colored bishops means that one player's bishop is on one color square and the other player's bishop is on another color square. So in this position, white's bishop is on a dark square, so it controls only dark squares on the chessboard. Black's bishop is on light squares, so it only controls light squares. Because those are opposite colored bishops, this game is most likely a draw. Even though white has 5 pawns and black only has 2 pawns, he was able to set up this blockade, and the bishop is just helping to control everything, and there's no way for white to get through because this bishop is essentially useless. It's not really doing anything because it can't attack any of these squares on the light colors. So opposite color bishop endings a lot of times will end in a draw. Principle number 19 is that bishops are better than knights in endgames that have pawns on both sides of the board. You can see in this position, if white plays a move like bishop d2, his bishop is attacking both of these pawns at the same time. Black's knight is not going to be able to defend them both at the same time, and this gives a huge advantage to white. Principle number 20 is that in queen endings, you have to watch out for perpetual check. In this position on the board, white is clearly winning, and he can even move this pawn forward and get a second queen, but it doesn't help him win the game because black could simply play queen c1 check, white has to move up, queen c2 check, white has to move back, queen c1 check, and you see that after 3 times of doing the same exact moves, the game is a draw. That's called threefold repetition, and there's no way white can get out of this position. He's in perpetual check from the queen because his king didn't have a safe place to take shelter at. So in queen endings, always be on the lookout for perpetual check by your opponent's queen, or you could end up in a situation like this and end up with a draw. Principle number 21 is that in rook endings, you should look to cut off your opponent's king when possible. In this position on the board, playing rook to e5 is a great move for white because it cuts off black's king from coming to prevent this pawn from becoming a queen. Now we simply have a king and a pawn against a rook, and white can use these to eventually move forward and get a queen, forcing black to sacrifice his rook. If black's king was, however, able to get in front of this pawn, white would not be able to do that. So cutting off the king with the rook is a crucial principle to remember. Principle number 22 is that in rook endings, rooks should be placed as far away from other pieces as possible. And this is especially true for kings. So in this same example that we just looked at, after the rook comes over here, black's probably going to move his king to attack the rook. So since this rook has to move somewhere, as the principle says, you should move it as far away from possible from other pieces, especially from the king. So in this case, where should we move our rook to? All the way back here. If we only move it one square, we're going to keep getting attacked by the king. You can see how this is very annoying. If we go back, instead, I should move it all the way back here, and it's now going to take black 4 moves to even attack my rook. So remember, rooks should go as far away from other pieces, especially kings, as possible. Principle number 23 is that a bishop, a flank pawn, so a pawn on one of these 2 files, and a king cannot win against a king that's already in the corner blockading your pawn unless your bishop covers the color of the corner. So in this case, we have a bishop on the light squares. It does not control that color square. We cannot win the game. And the reason is, as we try to move forward, black is simply going to just move back and forth all game. And eventually, if we ever try to move our pawn forward, it's a stalemate. And if we do something else with our bishop, he just keeps moving back. And eventually we have to push it forward. He still moves there, and we still get a stalemate if we move our king here. There's no way to make progress unless our bishop was on the other color. So as an example, if I go back a few moves to this position and put the bishop on the other color, now you can see instead of pushing the pawn forward, we can simply move our bishop, control the square, it forces his king away, and we can win. So it has to do with which color your bishop is, if it controls the corner square or not. Principle number 24 is what is known as Zugzwang. Zugzwang is when one player has a good position and they would like to just pass their turn, but they're not allowed to. And since they're not allowed to pass, they have to make a move which is a bad move and puts them into a worse position than before. That is called Zugzwang. So in the position on the board, if black is able to simply move his king back and forth, so he moves here, I move here, he moves here, I move here, he moves here, I move here, I'm never going to be able to get my king out of the way to get a queen and win the game. But what I can do is after black moves here, I can move my bishop there, take away control of that square, and I put black in Zugzwang. If he was able to simply pass and not make a move, I would never be able to win this game as white with just a bishop. I would have to get a queen, but I wouldn't be able to do that. However, since passing is not an option, black is forced to move away. These are the only 2 legal moves, and after he does that, my king can come out of the corner. So if we go back here, by me playing this bishop move here, I put black into Zugzwang and therefore won the game. Principle number 25 is that knights cannot lose a tempo like bishops can. So in this example that we just looked at, suppose in this position it was my turn as white, and I wanted to make it be black's turn so he would have to move. Well, I could simply move my bishop anywhere along this diagonal, like this, and that would be called losing a tempo. I essentially said, well, I don't really want to move right now, I'll just move my bishop here. Doesn't really do anything, and now it makes it become black's turn and he has to move. The principle that I just stated says that knights cannot do that like bishops can. So I'm going to change this example for a second and put a knight right here. The knight is controlling the same square that the bishop was. So suppose I want to try to win the game. I want to create Zugzwang and force black to move. The problem is it's my turn, so I have to do something with my knight. So let's say I move my knight here and black moves his king here. Let's say I move my knight here. Again, he's in check. He just moves up and I have the same problem. It's my turn and I'm controlling the square. So you might say, well, what if you just bring your knight somewhere way over here on the other side of the board and come back later and maybe that would work. Let's try it. I move here, he moves here. I move here, he moves here. I move here, moves here. Move here, moves here. Move here, he moves here. I'm going to come back. Guess what? It's check again. Same situation. And this is the point that I'm trying to make. You can't lose a tempo with a knight. Something about the way that the knights move, you just can't do it. With the bishop, you can very simply move it back on the diagonal. With a rook, you can do the same kind of thing, move it back on a file or a rank, but knights cannot lose a tempo. Well, hey guys, that wraps up this video on the top 25 endgame principles. I hope you learned something and found this useful. As always, thanks for watching. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.